Let's move to this now. Facebook parent company Meta has confirmed it has ditched the fact-checking program and also replaced it with community notes. The tech company says this is aimed at improving its fact-checking functions. For more on what this means, we're now joined by Mudiwa Gabaza, who is a tech writer. Mudiwa, good to have you on the program this evening. So, Meta's decision to phase out its third-party fact-checking program in favor of these community notes is quite a significant change, if you will. What do you think is driving this shift, and how will it impact the way misinformation is handled on Meta's platforms?
So good evening. There's a lot that, we obviously have to unpack with a move like this. And in terms of what's driving it, we can talk about, the current climate that we're in. But, one of the biggest points of consensus is that Mark Zuckerberg has made this move as a way to protect his company and also to help to ingratiate himself a little bit more with the incoming president in the United States, that is Donald Trump, because some people might remember that just a couple of years ago, after the January 6th insurrection in the United States, that Facebook actually banned Donald Trump off of their platform. But now we are in a different place now where Facebook/Meta, which is the parent company, is donating to the political campaign, rolling back some of its stances when it comes to fact-checking and moderation. And then I think the last one to also consider is to say where we are now in terms of content moderation. I'm keen to see how long-term that will be, based, on what public sentiment is around that particular issue.
Mudiwa, you speak of the name of Mark Zuckerberg, and he's mentioned that independent fact-checking organizations, introduced their own biases, which also led to a number of inconsistencies. How valid do you think these concerns are, especially on the part of Zuckerberg? Do you believe a community-based fact-checking could be a more proactive approach here?
That's an interesting one. Now, I'm not sure how effective the community approach will be, right? But what I can say, is that despite what I said just now about the fact that I think Mark is doing this, to secure political favor, there is a merit to a number of things that he did say. And one of them is around that, particular part. What people might not know or understand about how content moderation tends to work online is that there are two levels of, content moderation mainly. The first one is an automated form, and then the second one is a human form. And in many cases, what tends to happen, I will give YouTube as an example. When you upload a video to YouTube, it has a process where you upload your video and then it sits and basically transcribes, everything that's said in a video, checking for particular words, statements, phrases, that type of thing. And if there are any flagged statements or words, it, flags that in its system, and it might put a particular block on that particular video. And you see the same process happening on other platforms as well. And in certain cases, there are people that will be making videos that are intentionally meant to perhaps to educate, or that are for the good of a community, or that are meant to be positive. But because there are certain words that have been flagged, then that video becomes, either it gets taken out of the algorithm, or you might be forced to take down that piece of content, or one of the platforms might not show that content in the same way that would show any other content. So you become shadow banned, or your content just doesn't, go far because it's been flagged by the system. People then appeal, and then it gets handed over to a human being, and then that human being can make a judgment or a call, to say, okay, fine, perhaps there was an overstep here, we'll allow the content to go up. What I've just said is very simplified, but in essence, that's what Mark is talking about, to say there tends to be a lot of content that ends up being flagged or taken down that is actually not nefarious or actually negative, but it ends up being pulled together with the negative content because it carries certain things that the algorithms of the machines are then flagging. So there is some merit to that one. Community guidelines, on the other hand, it's almost as if he is pushing the policing of the platform back to the users to say, you know what, instead of us being the ones that are spending $5 billion, that's the number that I've seen in my research. Instead of us spending $5 billion around this issue, let us throw it back to the users so that they can be the ones that can make some of these calls, or at least flag some of that content.
Mudiwa, let's look at other developments. The move to reduce restrictions, for instance, on topics like immigration and gender, it seems to be an attempt to align with more mainstream discourse. How might this then affect the type of content that thrives on Meta's platforms? Or could it open the door for more harmful misinformation or even enhance open dialogue?
This one is a little bit harder to take forward, but one of the scenarios that I do see playing out is a situation where the type of discourse on these platforms, whether it's around some of the things that we've just spoken about, issues of gender and that type of thing, you now start having, more, let's call it, hate speech and, that type of thing. This is what people are afraid is going to start to happen. So in one of the scenarios, you might end up with a situation where people have often seen Twitter, or now X, as being a platform that is somewhat unhinged. The type of conversation, comments, the name calling, young people would say the savagery that happens on Twitter, people getting dragged, that type of culture is associated with Twitter/X. So one of the scenarios that may play out on Facebook or the other Meta platforms is a situation where you now start having that type of thing because the protections that would normally be in place to keep some of that discourse at bay or keeping it positive have now been lifted or taken out, of the system. So we might, find ourselves in a scenario where the level of discourse on those Meta platforms becomes akin to what we've been seeing on Twitter, over the last couple of years. I think the last one I would just throw in there. Yeah. When you're looking at what Zuckerberg has been doing, it's almost he's reverting back to factory settings, because for a long time, even before they introduced moderation back in, 2016, at the level that it's at now, he had always been saying, we don't want to be the arbiters of truth, which means we don't want to be the police on what people are saying. But at that time, in the face of Cambridge Analytica, in the face of, some of the whistleblowers talking about the impact of platforms on young people, body image, and all of that, they were forced into this position. So now almost taking it back to what the platform was before, but within a 2025 context.
But Mudiwa, in more general terms, and also in your opinion, what are the pros and cons of relying especially on community notes rather than professional fact checkers? Will the system create more accountability, especially for misinformation, or is it simply a way to reduce Meta's responsibility here?
The first one harkens back to what I said just now, that Zuckerberg reverting back to say we don't want to be the arbiters of truth. That's the first one. Second one is that depending on the type of community that you're in, you either have, a self-policing or almost self-healing, type of situation that can be created, or you then revert to a situation where you have, the most negative, content being what filters up, to the top. So those are some of the risks that are involved. And then I think the other one, to think about is that from an opportunity point of view, when we talk about pros and cons, as much as these a platform like Meta's platforms are taking out the fact checking and the content moderation, there might be an opportunity where third parties are the ones that are now gathering themselves and being the ones that go out and say, okay, fine, we are doing the work on your behalf to make sure that if you're looking at certain, news sources on these platforms, these are the actual facts and all of that. We've seen it with certain platforms that actually sit and will tell you, to say this type of reporting on a news website is leaning more left, or is it leaning more right? So, those types of platforms now exist. And in the void of, Zuckerberg having that in place, we might see an emergence of that type of thing. And then I think the other thing I would just highlight is the fact that from a community point of view, one of the examples that we can think about is to say, if you have a venue, let's call it a convention center. What responsibility does a venue owner have over the things that are discussed when someone is having an event at a venue? And this is basically the argument that the likes of Zuckerberg, have been throwing out for a couple of years. They were forced to do this policing, but now they're coming back and saying, hey, guys, we don't think this should be us. And then the last one is that on the most extreme side of this spectrum is what we saw with Pavel Durov, who is one of the founders and CEO of Telegram. He was recently arrested, in France, and a lot of that had to do with the criminal activity that was happening on Telegram, right? So you have, certain governments, certain nation states saying, you as the platform owner, you as the platform founder are responsible for the things that are being said on your platform. But then now Zuckerberg is basically coming back and saying, no, guys, we don't want to do that. So from a pros and cons point of view, I think going forward, it's going to be an interesting one to see how it goes, because as much as they can make this decision as a company, there can be certain countries, such as the European Union, that could come back and say, all right, that's what you want to do as a company, but if you want to operate in our territory, we will need you to make sure that you have the content moderation in place.
But Muriwa, Meta's change in policy also seems to coincide with political pressure, particularly in relation to the incoming Trump administration. Do you think this move is largely driven more, especially by political influence? We touched a bit on this, but more than just a genuine desire to improve the platform's integrity?
I think it's definitely a huge piece of the equation when it comes to how, Mark Zuckerberg has decided to implement, this particular change. And the reason for that, we spoke earlier on about the fact that Donald Trump had been banned off of some of the Meta platforms following, the January 6th incident, from the last election. That's the first point. But the other thing that people need to be aware of and think about is the fact that there is a lot of lobbying that Meta as a company does. I've seen some research that says that Meta is probably one of the biggest spenders when it comes to lobbying into government in the United States. So they have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to trying to have good relationships with policymakers, or at least making sure that there aren't policies that are going to negatively harm them. Earlier on, I mentioned the whistleblower, case around, body image and, Meta actually knowing the fact that its platforms were actually harming how young ladies, I think, in the teenage years were viewing and thinking of themselves. And there was a whistleblower who exposed that fact. And over that, we had policymakers actually launching an investigation into that. As soon as the government gets reconstituted following, Donald Trump's inauguration on January 20, it is actually expected that, Mark Zuckerberg will be back, in front of policymakers in the United States to answer on that, particular case. And he's been answering on other cases. So part of the thinking is to say that Meta is trying to invest in ways to, soften their landing when they do face policymakers in the coming months. They're probably preparing themselves and positioning themselves so that they can have a better time when they do face, some of those lawmakers just now.
Right. Mudiwa Gabaza, thank you so much for your time and giving us your perspective on this insightful analysis of Meta's new approach, especially to the content moderation as well.